In sports, much like in the entertainment industry, someone could be sat around waiting for their big break, just grinding and grinding and grinding, doing whatever they can, but sort of just sitting in mediocrity. And when that break does finally come, it could come at the end of that person's career. Whereas like in entertainment, people can find fame a little bit later on and still have a decent career. Some sports people that peaked after the age of 30 or had what were considered anonymous careers until breaking out later on include Luka Modric, Sonny Liston, Hakeem Olajuwon, apparently, Michael Jordan, also apparently, Jamie Vardy and Stuart Bingham. And there's also a few professional wrestlers who are able to break into the WWE a little bit later simply because the days of drinking and taking painkillers have been replaced with them simply taking a break. Dave Bautista was 31 when he started, as was Braun Strowman. Diamond Dallas Page was 32, and Rico, remember him? He was 37. LA Knight was pushing 40 when he broke into the WWE. Yeah! And the same kind of journeyman tag, if you want to use that, has been used in motorsports as well. Jos Verstappen, Martin Brundle, Johnny Herbert, although those last two were hamstrung by injuries as well that probably didn't help things, but more on those two at a later date. Jenson Button was also considered a journeyman and didn't get his break until the Braun year. And Google is also throwing up the names of Landon Castle, Michael McDowell, Matt DiBenedetto and Connor Daly. But somebody else might have to confirm those. But like I say, there are some people in sports who get their breaks just so late they're not able to do anything with it simply because they're over the hill. Or put more simply, they're too old. Just like Luca Badoer when he was called up in 2009 to replace the injured Felipe Massa. Now, images are going to be hard to come by on this one, so if you're looking at something that isn't Luca Badoer, it's just for illustration purposes only. Sorry. So who is Luca Badoer and how did his career lead to this moment? Now, I've mentioned his name several times in these videos because he's had, well, a bit of a journeyman career. You know how I've mentioned the late 80s and early 90s as the era of Italian paid drivers and shoestring budget teams holding on with nothing but hopes and dreams? Well, the chances are Badoer was driving for one of them, but not to the extent as our old mate Roberto Moreno. Badoer had enjoyed a decent junior career, beginning his karting adventures in 1985 and moving up to Italian Formula 3 in 1989. That was a learning year, and in 1990 he moved to another team and scored his first ever win in cars by beating Alessandro Zanardi and Roberto Colciago at Vallelunga, and those two were the championship favourites. The win allowed him to finish 10th in the championship, and in 1991 he seemed to become a genuine contender for the title when he did what I like to call the full Mick Schumacher. Be anonymous for a good chunk of the season, and then suddenly be winning races. Sounds suspicious. And it was. It later turned out they were using iffy tyres. Now, before I get piled on, I am not suggesting for 1 second that Mick was cheating. If he was, he would have probably been found out because the way they do things is a lot more stringent these days. Just trying to clear all this up, but the pattern was similar. He was nowhere and then started winning races. I mean, hopefully that one gets through to people, but it probably will get past a couple. But this didn't stop Badoer progressing up the ranks. In 1992, he joined the International Formula 3000 series, later known as GP2 and is now Formula 2, and was a series for 3-litre spec cars made by either Reynard or Lola in those days, hence the 3000 for 3000cc. But actually, there was one Ralt on the grid, and good luck to those guys because Reynard was the chassis to have, and Lola had gone all of 1991 without a win. And the grid in 1992 was stacked with named drivers. Rubens Barrichello, David Coulthard, Jean-Marc Gounon, Laurent Aiello, Emmanuel Collard, Olivier Panis, Alan McNish, Mark Scaife, Emanuele Naspetti, and Andrea Montemini, or Montermini. I'm going to stick with Montermini because 1996 VHS tape. Either way, all of these drivers I've just mentioned went on to have careers in various forms of motorsport, and Badoer beat the lot of them, finishing 12 points ahead of future teammate Montermini. After finishing 5th, 6th and 6th at Silverstone, Po and Barcelona, he bounced back and won at Pagusa. Wherever that is, that's something I might need to have a look at. And he also won at Hockenheim and the Nürburgring, before suffering an accident at Spa that cracked his helmet. He bounced back with 2nd place at Albacete, before winning at Nogaro and beat championship favourite Barrichello. And you don't win Formula 3000 by being slow, especially against all of those drivers I've just mentioned. But the thing is, at the end of 1992, Badoer and Barrichello would be holding contracts for Formula 1 teams in 1993. Barrichello would be going to Jordan, and Badoer would be going to somewhere called BMS Scuderia Italia. and after that, their careers could not have been any different. BMS Scuderia Italia, or just simply the Dallara team, was Ferrari light. But in 1993, they were no longer Dallara, because Dallara was no longer making the chassis for those cars. And the problem was that while between 1988 and 1992 they'd been decent mid-pack runners, the car couldn't develop. And now without Dallara building the cars, the team had to find another way. And when money is a problem, the car becomes a problem. It is the history of Formula 1. And they were using old Ferrari engines, which wasn't going to help either. But they did have some investment from a rich Italian called Beppe Lucchini, and the Dallara became a Lola. The car was bulky, basic, and had none of the gizmos that any of the other teams were using. And I'm not just talking about Williams and McLaren at the top, I'm talking about even Minardi, because this car didn't even have traction control. It had nothing. And as a result, BMS were excluded from any vote involving driver aids, because they were always going to vote against what the other teams wanted. So if the other teams wanted to keep them, they'd simply vote no. And because it needed a unanimous decision, the votes were always going to be hung. So if you exclude them, then the others will be able to get their way. At Badoer's first race in South Africa, he was 9 seconds slower than Prost pole time, but then at Brazil, the FIA said only 25 cars could start the race. While he made the grid in 21st at Brazil, he didn't qualify at Donington, and then managed to finish 7th at Imola, agonisingly close to a single point, which was taken by Fabrizio Barbazza's Minardi. They almost won the Canadian Grand Prix, but on a technicality. Mosley had initially banned the driver aids effective immediately, and none of the cars would have passed scrutineering. BMS, who had no gizmos, would have had an easy one too, but then the FIA recanted and said the ban would come at the end of the year instead. BMS didn't complete the full season. They didn't do the 2 flyaway rounds in Japan and Australia that concluded that season and folded, although they did merge with Minardi to pool the resources to help keep Minardi alive instead, so they were Minardi BMS through 1994. At the same time, Badoer was being courted by Benetton, but ultimately they picked JJ Leto to go alongside Schumacher for that year, and then that had its own problems, as I've covered in its own dedicated video. So Badoer went to Minardi and was their test driver for the whole year, and then got promoted to the full-time seat for 1995. In the days of unlimited testing, you'd think that he would have kept some sort of race sharpness through 1994. But he was driving for Minardi, who couldn't afford to do the same amount of testing as Williams, Ferrari, McLaren, Benetton, and so on. So Badoer would often be at the back end of the field, and his spatial awareness while being lapped annoyed the front runners. While 40 were the clowns of the field with their car being as slow as it was, and Pacific weren't exactly loved by the front running teams either, Badoer joined them in having the tag of being a mobile chicane. But he did have some upsides. Top 10 finishes on 4 occasions would be a decent haul of points for a team like Minardi today. Pedro Lamy got a singular point at the season-ending Australian Grand Prix, a race Luca didn't even start, and despite only doing half the season, Pedro Lamy finished ahead of Luca due to his 2 7th place finishes. All of this contributing to the stat that Badoer still has, of having the most laps completed in Formula 1 without scoring a single point. He was still finishing races many laps down, and drivers like Badoer, much like the guys at 40 and Pacific, must have been sweating after Monaco because Mosley had introduced the 107% rule for 1996. And Badoer, along with his new teammate Montermini, who he joined at 40 for 1996, have the unenviable stat of being the first 2 men to fall foul of the 107% rule at the very first race it was introduced. He did finish in Brazil, 4 laps down on race winner Hill, who lapped everybody except Alesi in 2nd place, but was then flipped over by Deniz's Ligier while Pedro came round to lap him. At Monaco, he got in the way of Villeneuve on the way down to the hairpin while being lapped, and took the Williams and his 40 out of that race as well. And that was a race where 40 only started 1 car due to a lack of spare parts. But when the new car finally arrived, Badoer outqualified Rossett's footwork, but the writing was on the wall for 40. Failure of sponsors to pay up meant that the team got a few token laps at Silverstone just to appease Ford, but were gone by the time they reached Germany. 1997 was spent doing some uncompetitive runs in the FIA GT Championship, not because he himself was slow, but because the Lotus Elise he was driving was slow. Hang on a second, a Lotus Elise GT1? This I need to see. But for 1998, Badoer was thrown a lifeline. Nicola Larini was leaving Ferrari's test driver role and Jean Todt asked Badoer to take over, and the results were revelatory to an extent. Between Schumacher, Badoer, Irvine, Brawn and Byrne, they managed to overcome the deficit to McLaren to the point where the Michael was in contention for a championship at the end of the season. only to be let down at the final race by stalling his car on the grid and then losing a tyre on some debris caused by a collision between a Tyrrell and a Minardi, I think it was. But in 1999, he was back at Minardi, and heartbreak at the European Grand Prix. He'd started 19th and had worked his way up to 4th with the correct calls for tyre choice and everybody else, including the top cars, all falling off in one way or another. With just over 10 laps left and Hakkinen and Irvine nowhere to be found, he might have at least finished 5th, but his gearbox seized, leaving the Italian sobbing at the side of the track. Genet, his teammate, scored a point, but for Badoer it was a case of, what do I have to do? So, as it was for the 2000 season, he was back at Ferrari. And it's quite ironic in a way, because Barrichello, whom Badoer had battered comprehensively in F3000, was one of the main beneficiaries of all his testing miles. And he stayed there, racking up something in the region of 20,000 kilometres of testing just in 2000 alone. Like I mentioned, these are the long gone days of unlimited testing your own private test track. It's said that Badoer constantly rejected drives from mid-tier teams to stay at Ferrari, although he was considered to be the one who would have driven for Sauber, which were essentially the Ferrari B team at the time, should Raikkonen not have got his super license, and ironically, he would later work with Raikkonen. Badoer was the only constant at Maranello in the early 2000s. Genet and Bertie, who were also on the test program, went. Barrichello left at the end of 2005, Schumacher at the end of 2006. Braun left to go to Honda, and Todd went just after that as well. If you want loyalty, you're looking at it. While he was the Ferrari test driver, Ferrari won 7 constructors' titles and 6 drivers' titles. So for 2009, his loyalty was somewhat rewarded. Test drivers were a dying breed by 2009. The FIA was clamping down on mid-season testing and starting to nudge things towards where they are now, where it's 3 days pre-season and, well, that's it, along with whatever they decide to run in the middle, but even then, only certain drivers get to do those tests. Test drivers were now being rebranded as reserve drivers, and as things were moving on, Luca's job would be under threat, because he was now 38 years old, and there were academy drivers being bred who could do the job instead should something happen to Raikkonen or Massa, like Jules Bianchi for instance. But then something did happen to Massa. I need to do the full story at some point, but the long and short of it is a spring came off Barrichello's Brawn and hit Massa in the head at the Hungaroring. Massa was now in a hospital in a medically induced coma as they tried to figure out what had happened to him and how to keep him alive, so Badoer was called up to race at the European Grand Prix. But there are several things we have to take into account here. Firstly, Luca was incredibly lucky to have the nod in the first place. Schumacher was supposed to be the one that came in and replaced Massa, but he'd hurt his neck falling off a motorcycle or something along those lines and wasn't fit enough. Secondly, Luca, as mentioned, was now 38 years old, and he was going to be the oldest driver on the grid by some margin, and he hadn't driven a Formula 1 car in a competitive capacity since the Japanese Grand Prix of 1999, nearly 10 years ago. The only times he'd driven the 2009 Ferrari were in the simulator and a demo run at Fiorano, and there were the superstitious things to take into account too, because he'd have car number 3, which would have been his number in 1999 if it was him and not Salo that took over after Schumacher broke his leg, and then his return to Grand Prix racing was going to be the European Grand Prix. The same name of Grand Prix where his Minardi had broken down and left him crying at the side of the road. So he finally gets to live his dream of being a Ferrari Formula 1 driver. But it turned into a nightmare. The first practice comes round and he's 3.4 seconds off Barrichello and Hamilton's initial pace. Then he was fined for speeding in the pit lane, because since he was racing the pit lane speeds had dropped from around 70 miles an hour to 40, but he managed to improve in the second practice to find more time and be only 2.7 off the pace. But in qualifying, he was last on the grid. 4.1 seconds off Jensen's time in the first qualifying session and 2 seconds behind Jaime Alguersuari. At the next round of the season in Belgium, this Ferrari would be a race-winning car, but Badoer was making it look like one of his old Minardis. If we had social media stat padders who make supporting a driver their entire personality like these people on Twitter, we might have had people saying that the Ferrari was as bad as a 1990s Minardi, and it was simply Kimi's genius that was keeping it up the front end of the field. I mean, the Ferrari was a bit bad, it was a bit difficult to drive, but it certainly wasn't crap. I mean, Badoer was really bad out there, like really, really bad. Luca finished 17th of the 18 finishes. Nakajima being classified because he completed 90% race distance, so he was last on track and a lap down on Barrichello. That must have stung. He did all that testing work for Rubens at Ferrari, and now Rubens had that all-conquering brawn. While this weekend might have been a no-pressure, ease-into-it type of deal before the weekend began, the Sharks were now circling. Jarno Trulli had jumped to Badoer's defence, but Ferrari was looking at this and thinking, we can't have that happen again. Now, Trulli did have a modicum of a point when he stepped in to defend his fellow countrymen. At the start, Badoer had been tagged by Grosjean, and that didn't help, but Badoer would have escaped being hit if he just qualified a bit further up the grid. But there had been some, well, amateurish moments. Luca had also copped a drive-through for crossing the white line on pit exit, something he never had to be aware of 10 years prior, and when he came into Parc Ferme, he dinked Sutil's Force India. So going into the Belgian Grand Prix, any excuses about not being used to the car were simply not going to fly. He had to perform and, well, there wasn't going to be anywhere for him to hide. In first practice for the Belgian Grand Prix, he was 10th, but it was a wet session and not representative at all. And at the same time, the journalists were pouring jet fuel onto the raging inferno as to asking constant questions as to whether or not Luca would be capable of actually performing in that car. And then those same journalists were going, see? When Luca was then back to the rear end of the grid when the track dried out. He did get up to 18th on Saturday morning and was less than a second off Kimi, but qualifying came round and he was nowhere. 1.8 seconds off the best time and half a second slower than rookie Grosjean in 19th. Rumours were now flying around that Fisichella will take over for the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, especially since he just banged his Force India on pole position. The duality of Ferrari at that time. Raikkonen won the race in a hard-fought battle with Fisichella, while Badoer was once again last, 14th of the finishers, and was on the cusp of being lapped. Had Raikkonen had less of a battle with Fisi, that might have been the case. He was insistent that Monza would be better, and was hoping to race for Ferrari at its home race, but Fisichella had indeed been called up. As we learned from the Fisichella retrospective, Fisi didn't do much better. It seemed that both of them were past their prime, and on top of that, that Ferrari wasn't exactly a get-in-and-go machine. So at the end of the season, Luca left Ferrari and Fisichella replaced him. He did receive a lot of praise from Luca de Montezemolo, saying that Badoer had played a massive part in the team's early 2000 successes and did such a valuable job even if it wasn't considered glamorous or otherwise anywhere near the spotlight, because it was Schumacher that got all the plaudits at the time, wasn't it? Badoer said that his only regret was only getting to do 2 races for Ferrari. He has a son called Brando, and he finished 6th in Italian F4 in 2023. Brando is now part of the McLaren Young Driver program, so maybe we'll get to see the Badoer name once again at some point. So it must suck to get your break so late in your career, and then to finally achieve your dream, in this case driving in Formula 1 for Ferrari, and only doing 2 races where you were miles off the pace, and then get dumped for somebody else. But at the same time, there's got to be some silver linings in there. I mean, you got to achieve your dream, no matter how much of a nightmare it was, but I don't know. I'd like to know what you think down in the comments. So then, a look at the career of Luca Badoer, and where it all went wrong for him when it came for him to get his big break after Felipe Massa's horrific injury in 2009. If this has given you some insight into days gone by, then do like the video so I know a good job was done, and for more stuff like this from the channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on any future uploads. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads over at Patreon that continue to support me at a more personal level, and if you want to help out with keeping the lights on around here, there'll be a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Or the super thanks for a one and done donation or to just top up my coffee cup, and memberships for those that want a Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.